Hey, good afternoon. Welcome everyone. Okay, for some of you, it's good morning. So it's a great honor to have Dr. Briggs to give us a talk about publication as part of the NCME Graduate Student Council. Many of you should have known Dr. Briggs, and he is a past president of NCME during 2021 to 2022. And he's also a past editor of Journal of Education Measurement Issues and Practices. He's currently a professor in Research Evaluation Methodology Program at University of Colorado. And he also directs the Center of Assessment Design, Research, and Evaluation. Dr. Briggs' research focuses on advancing methods for the measurement and evaluation of student learnings. He has won many awards and published numerous articles on educational measurement. So we will welcome him to talk about publication today, and we'll have some time at the end for questions.
Great. Thanks, Long Li. Hi, everybody. Great to have some time with you today, and we'll definitely try to make this so there's plenty of time for you guys to ask questions. And even along the way, feel free to chime in if you have, a question along the way. Happy to stop and interact with you in that way. And I'd kind of, I think before we get started, one thing would be helpful for me to know, how many of you have already given a presentation at a conference, whether it be NCME or elsewhere? If you have given a presentation, maybe you could use the reactions thing. You could put up a emoji or raise hand or something like that, just so I could see how many of you have presented before at a conference. Okay, yeah, so a fair number of you have already given a presentation at a conference. That's great. So good. So some of you had that experience, and hopefully then you can kind of connect up some of the suggestions I have to sort of your own experiences doing it, and we can share those out at the end a little bit, to what extent your experience in presenting and then how that's gone afterwards has helped you move through a pipeline that potentially leads you to publication. So let me start by sharing screen. I do have some slides I put together for this, and I'll be happy to share the slides afterwards. So I'll start by doing that. Hopefully that's possible. Yeah, good. Okay, let me get this going. Okay, so hopefully everybody's seeing my screen and seeing my slides. Okay, so let me go into this straight away. So here is really the pipeline of progress that I think we all want when we present at a conference. It goes something like this. You have some idea for a study that emerges, right? And it might emerge from you personally or part of a project you're working on, but some idea comes up. We submit an NCME conference proposal, right? And hopefully it gets accepted. We work hard on our study after, while it's being accepted. Then time comes for the conference. We present our study at the NCME conference. We get great feedback from discussant and audience. Then we turn the paper into a journal manuscript. We submit it to, say, EMIP or GEM. It's accepted, published, fame, fortune, tenure, celebration, right? So this is the pipeline I think we all want, right? This is what we're looking for. And I know you're probably thinking the next slide is going to be that's a fantasy, but actually this really is possible, right? I don't know, maybe the fortune part might be a little bit extreme. I can't promise that, or the fame, I suppose, but the rest of it is all realistic. But I would say that it takes a lot of planning, discipline, and what I would call making your own good luck, right? And what I mean by that is it's not to say that getting your work from conference presentation into publication is just a matter of luck. It's just that there are always moments when there are opportunities, and how you make the most of your opportunity can be a form of good luck, right? And I think sometimes we don't realize when that's sort of presenting itself and how we make our own good luck. So that's a little bit of what I'm going to talk about today. So things I'm going to assume, but I'm not going to focus on today, is that you are or have been involved in a study or project that has at least the potential to make a contribution to the field. that you have operationalized your research questions appropriately. And maybe this has been done if you're a graduate student with input from an advisor, senior colleague, or another other mentor. That you have data that can be used to address your research questions, and that you're going to have the opportunity to present your work at a conference. And this could come either in the form of a paper presentation session, or could even come in the form of a poster presentation session. So the first thing is, well, how should you prepare for this? Let's assume here that you're going to have this opportunity. What I would say is like my first and most maybe important piece of advice to you is, regardless of what it is, the session that you plan to present in, draft a conference paper that is finished at least 1 week before your presentation, right? So I would say write that conference paper, even if you're presenting a poster, write one even if everyone else in your session is just presenting slides, write one even if your session has no discussant, right? The reason I say this is so important is that it's really only in the process of writing a paper that includes all the sort of typical elements of a research paper, like an introduction, background, methods, results, and discussion, that you're going to come to appreciate what you understand and what you don't about the topic at hand. It's very easy to convince yourself when you're just putting together a PowerPoint presentation that everything is somewhat seamless and smooth in what you've done. You'll find often that it's once you're writing out all the details of everything that you start to see where there might be holes, where there might be interesting results or unexpected results. So I really encourage that if you're hoping to turn a presentation ultimately into a publication, the sooner that you can write things out into a manuscript form, the better chance that you're going to have. And I think this is especially salient today. I'm seeing more and more when I participate in NCME sessions, and I don't know if this extends beyond the NCME conference, more and more when I'm a discussant, I'm just getting sent slides, or I'm in sessions where you may not even get the slides sent in advance, but it's becoming the point where people's papers are really their slides. And I think that's a bit of a loss. And I think that's one way in which it's quite likely that you're going to run into some obstacles in trying to go from a conference presentation to a publication. The other thing I would suggest in how you should prepare for a conference that I have almost never seen anyone do, especially not a graduate student, is invite people, even people you don't know, to attend your talk. Right. So if you have people that you are thinking of, boy, I would love if when I finish this study and I could publish the study, here are the people I kind of look up to in the field. I hope that they'll read my paper, right? Invite those people to your talk, like reach out. You know, if there's somebody that you're really hoping to be there, you don't have to leave it to chance, right? I think, you know, I haven't received this, and maybe it's because nobody wants me at their talk, but I would love if a graduate student reached out to me and said, you know, Derek, I'm going to be at a conference. I really like, you know, the work you've done, and I'm doing something related. It would be a great honor if you'd come to my talk, and I'd hope to see you there. And if not, you know, maybe we could find some other time to chat about it. Boy, that's a great thing to do. And I haven't seen it done, but I highly recommend it as a thing to do to prepare and going to the conference. So here's another piece once you're actually at the conference and you're presenting. And this is the sort of thing I would imagine. And I would think that probably a lot of what I'm saying, I hope, overlaps with the sorts of things maybe you're hearing from an advisor or from senior graduate students maybe that are in your own program. But when you go to a conference, it sort of goes without saying, but I'll say it anyway. You really want to make the best possible impression. So what does this mean? Well, number one, first and foremost, make sure you send your paper to your discussant as early as possible. And if you're going to be late, sometimes things happen. They're outside your control where it might not be possible because you're working with collaborators or something has happened with the data. These things do come up. And I think most discussants have all been there and understand it. So as long as you're communicating with the discussant about what's going on, that goes a long way. The worst thing you could do is have no lines of communication to the discussant never gets anything from you. And you arrive to your presentation with sort of a surly discussant who's not going to be very pleased at sort of kind of coming in and being blindsided by what you have to say. So I think sending these things in advance is a really, really important thing for you to do. And again, I recommended in the previous slide that you really should aim to have a paper to submit. Again, if that's not possible, at the very least, you'd want to send the slides in advance. The other thing, I hope you've gotten this as feedback from mentors that you have around and other colleagues, but it's really important to practice your talk in advance. When I was a graduate student, I can still remember the days leading up to my talk and time spent in my hotel room, going over the talk again and again. And I think this is so important. Now, you will get to a point, I can't say that I always practice my talks in advance, but I will say this, that no talk I've given where I've practiced hasn't improved. And I think in particular, again, if you don't have, sometimes if you have a longer talk, it's hard to over and over again do the 15 minutes, right? Or the 20 minutes it might be if it's longer talk. So what I often would suggest is at a minimum, practice the first 2 minutes. The first 2 minutes of your talk are the most important part of your talk, because it's in that 2 minutes that the people that are in the audience that are listening, they're forming their opinion about the level of interest they have in what you're saying. They're taking you in and sort of making sense of whether they think you have something interesting to say. Those first 2 minutes are really important. So the smoother you are in those first 2 minutes, right, the more likely the rest of your talk is going to go very well. So I really recommend for my own students, just really make sure your opening is polished, right? And then you'll get comfortable, right? So if you kind of, when you are giving a presentation, it's typically that first minute or two where you're the most nervous. And so if you kind of know exactly what you're going to do in those first 2 minutes, then you kind of find that your heart rate has gone down a little bit and the rest of your talk will be a lot better. Dressing professionally, right? It's a small thing, but it is sort of important. That doesn't mean you have to have necessarily, I think that conference attire over time has become more business casual. But when in doubt, err on the side of dressing too professionally, so I even told, one of my students, go ahead and wear a tie. You'll find that a lot of people at NCME don't wear ties. But better to err on the side of, showing up with a tie and a suit and have people say, hey, that's more than I need, than showing up with a Hawaiian shirt, right? So, making a good first impression is really important. The other piece that I think is important is that when you're giving a presentation, you should have, if you've done your homework and you've practiced and you've done all the work leading up to it, you should be confident in what you have to say. This is something that you know more than anybody else about. So you should have some confidence when you're giving your talk, right? It can be very off-putting when you have somebody come up and it seems like they don't actually believe in what they're saying, right? So you want to convey to the people in the audience, this is something you know things about. At the same time, you certainly don't want to be cocky about it, right? You want to be sort of modest and open to feedback. And, if you can, at times, a little bit of self-deprecation can go a long way. Now, I think a really important thing for people to appreciate is that your paper and your presentation are two different things, right? And what I see graduate students sometimes fall into a trap of, and actually not just graduate students, but even, more senior people, even in the field, is that what people end up trying to do is to give their entire paper in 12 minutes, right? And that's never going to work quite well. You have to appreciate that really your presentation is just an advertisement for your study. And so you need to tailor that advertisement to the audience at hand. Now, I give as nice contrast the sort of audience you would get at NCME, which is you can generally assume is a somewhat more technically adept audience. And contrast that to the National Conference on Student Assessment that CCSO puts on, right? So that tends to be a little bit of a less technically focused context. So you need to know what that context is. And if you're giving a presentation for NCME, there are certain things you can get away with in presenting. and that, that you don't have to assume you have to explain in great detail, but that might not work for a less technical audience. So just thinking very carefully in your presentation, who's my audience? What do I expect they're going to be able to understand is critically important. This third bullet that I have on the slide is something I tell all my students, is that in the end, people are going to forget what you said. Right? It's 12 minutes, 15 minutes, right? There's a bunch of other ones. They might remember a little bit that day, but a few days later, they aren't going to remember for the most part what it is exactly that you had to say. But what they will remember is how you said it, right? So it's just so important in sort of the way that you comport yourself, the organization of your talk, that what they can remember is sort of the gestalt of what you had to do, what you did in your talk. More so than all the very, very fine-grained details. For people to understand the details, what's going to happen is they're going to have to read your paper, right? So again, what you want to do is get them interested enough in what you're doing that they're going to want to request your paper and go into those details. And that's where they're going to really understand the finer grain information. The other thing that so along these lines, what I would suggest is think about your paper and think about your study and think to yourself, like, what is really the most interesting or unexpected thing that's come up in this study? And find a way to have that be the focus of your advertisement of your talk, right? And get in there and make sure that is the thing that you're spending your time on. So that if they do say, take away a big picture thing from your talk, it's that thing that was the most surprising or interesting or unexpected. They don't necessarily have to need to know everything about the details of the background of your talk and the like. Okay, so two things that I think I want to actually give as some examples is things to be careful about in giving presentations are these last two bullets. Be careful about displaying big tables of results. This is something I often see at NCME presentations that can be problematic. And then what I call a focus on graphical excellence being something you need to pay close attention to. So here's an example of what I mean. You'll sometimes have people give a presentation and all of a sudden the slide will come up like this, right? And don't do this because when you put up a table like this is great for a paper, right? Because when you present something like this in a paper, people have the time to go through and read and in your narrative, you're able to walk people through the salient details and information. In a conference presentation, this is overwhelming. It's way too much information, and it's very hard for people to know what to be looking at first. And to be honest, it's a little bit lazy because often what happens is you've created a table like this for a paper, and instead of taking the time to craft something that's tailored to your presentation, you're just copying and pasting the table from your paper into your presentation. Okay, so let me give you an example of how you could do something like this where the key information is in the form of a lot of text or a lot of table, but at the same time being more tailored and more sort of cognizant of this setting. So I'll just give you an example for something I did in a presentation a number of years ago. So what I was showing, this slide here is work I was doing where I was developing what's called a learning progression. And it was a learning progression for in mathematics for the big picture concept of proportional reasoning. What I wanted people to see was just how involved the learning progression was, that it had on the left side a number of levels that were focused on the attributes of what students knew and could do regarding proportional reasoning. On the right side, it had information about what you'd expect to see in items that would be written to students at each level. But what I did was I just showed this to give people the sense of the scope of the learning progression, that it spanned from a level 1 to a level 7, the grades that were focused. And then what I did instead is I briefly just showed this. I said, listen, I'm not trying to get you to focus on the text. I just want you to get a sense for the scope of the learning progression and that it has a person side and an item side. And what I'm going to be focusing on is one of these particular levels. And so then I had this box that came in at level 5. And then in my next slide, I zoomed in on that particular level, level 5, to really break this out and say, oh, this piece on the left, this is the person side. It says what you're expecting a student to be able to know and understand about proportional reasoning. On the right-hand side, this explains the kind of item template for how you would elicit that kind of information. And then I even showed further, here's a specific example of what an item might look like that follows the principles of those template. So I went from this large, very tons of information and just zoomed in on a particular element and said, here, this is what I want you to focus attention on. So this is an example of where I'm taking something that might have been this very large, immense table, and I'm really zooming on something that someone can actually make sense of as part of the presentation. The other thing I want to mention is principles of graphical excellence. I hope some of you maybe have heard of the work of Ed Tufte. So this is from his book in 1983. He has these 3 principles of graphical excellence, right? And the visualization here, the little picture, comes from his book. It's a pretty nice one. It really captures the idea of what's going on when you're giving a presentation in sort of an NCME conference type setting. You should be thinking about every person at the seat. They're looking up at your PowerPoint, right? And what's going on in their head is it's generating ideas for the people in your audience, right? And so you need to be thinking about how much time is it going to take when they're looking up at the graphic you've created in your presentation? How much time is it going to take for them to generate those sorts of ideas? Tufte's concept is this really has a lot to do with the ratio between the amount of ink that's devoted into your graphic and the amount of space, right? And so that you really want to maximize sort of, the ink to space ratio, right? And convey as much information about the data as you possibly can, right? Without having extraneous information that detracts from the story you're trying to tell. Okay, so these 3 principles, graphical excellence, the well-designed presentation of interesting data. Again, emphasis on interesting, right? So you have to in advance have decided what is an interesting aspect of the story I'm trying to tell. The second one, graphical excellence, consists of complex ideas communicated with clarity, precision, and efficiency. Okay, and the third one is excellence is that which gives the viewer the greatest number of ideas in the shortest time with the least ink in the smallest space. Right, so one thing I always say as advice for my students is just think, when you put up a graphic, basically you get maybe 5 seconds to 10 seconds at most for the person that's seeing the graphic to take away the main point, right? If it's going to take more than that, then it's up to you to be able to really walk them through that, right? So you can scaffold them and help them see the big point. But ideally, if you've done a great job with the graphic, you'd like it to be able to stand on its own without you having to do a ton of hand-holding along the way. That said, I'm surprised by how often people put up a typical sort of graphic with an X and Y axis and do not actually explain what the two axes represent. So if you put up a plot that is like, for example, a scatter plot, right, you need to walk through and say, here's a scatter plot. What I'm showing you on the X-axis is this. What I'm showing you on the Y-axis is this. Right? Don't just assume that it sort of stands on its own if it's going to need a little bit of hand-holding. And this goes in with, if you've done a good job practicing, hopefully you have colleagues that have looked at it and they'll tell you, oh yeah, I wasn't really following that. You needed to give me some breadcrumbs. So that was Tufte's principles of graphical excellence. These are Derek's principles of effective graphics, okay? The first one is like borrowed from the medical field, is that your graphic should do no harm, right? So the last thing you want to do is create a graphic that obfuscates more than it clarifies, right? So if the graphic is going to leave people confused, then you've actually done harm. And in that case, you're better off not having the graphic at all, right? So make sure your graphic is actually not getting in the way of your presentation. Sometimes graphics that are really clear and obvious to you are not so clear and obvious to others. So that's my idea there. The second one, again, connects back, is make sure the choice of graphic is connected to your target audience, is relevant for your target audience. Make sure that you know the purpose of your graphic. What is your graphic there to do, right? What is it meant to accomplish? Know the setting in which the graphic will be used. Again, this is so critical for a presentation. You can have a tremendous graphic that's very effective in the context of your paper because you've had time perhaps to sort of build up to it, to write about it, and to lead people through it. Maybe that same graphic won't work so well as part of a presentation when you might only have 30 to 45 seconds. The other piece is if you're creating a graphic I would almost never accept the software defaults, right? I think one of the ones that I have the greatest bone to pick is I think Stata, if I don't use Stata, I use R, but Stata's software defaults for like histograms are like a kind of like a mud brown. I hate them with a plague. So, just be conscious of what you're doing. If you love the mud brown, fine, but make sure that was your choice, that you decided that the way I wanted to go forth was with that particular color. Make conscious decisions about things like color, whether you're using it or not, the choice of scale, the unit on the scale. Make sure that you're making that choice and not just outsourcing it to the software. Following your presentation, I say that it's really important to build momentum from giving a conference presentation. So after the conference, I think it's easy to fall into the trap of being like, wow, I gave a presentation. It worked out okay. People seem to like it. I'm done. I can put that presentation on my Vita and, maybe I've written a conference paper and great, let's move on to the next thing. Especially if you're a student, you might be coming back and have finals to start working on or other things related to your graduate trajectory. And so it's easy to sort of then shelve the conference paper. But I would suggest that you really want to sort of build on the momentum. So one of the things I would recommend is after you leave the conference, contact the discussant and anyone else who gave you feedback, right? Thank them for the feedback they gave you. Ask them additional questions if you didn't have the opportunity during the session itself. The other thing to do is if you're working on a paper where you have collaborators, it's really important to meet with the collaborators right within the week after your conference and debrief. What were the takeaways? What are the things that you can build on? What are things that you're going to decide that you're not going to take up? What's sort of your plan of attack? Here's something I think very few people do. I think it's a really effective strategy. Write yourself a memo, right? What have you learned after giving the presentation at the conference? What do you see as your next steps? And what's a timeline that you're going to build and actually stick to? Those are all things that you could create as part of a memo following giving a conference presentation. And then I really think it's important, and this is for graduate students and for junior faculty and senior faculty, for all of us, it's really hard to write a manuscript while you're taking classes, while you're teaching classes. In the middle of a semester is a really tough time. The time where you're most likely to be able to get this done is when you have uninterrupted writing time. So often targeting right after the semester as a time to get moving on this is really important, right? And so I think that the timing of the NCME conference lends itself to that. It's usually towards the end of a spring semester. So you can, if you've done all the things above and set yourself a timeline, you could really be using the summer as the time to creating a manuscript that takes up what you learned from giving the presentation and improves upon it and could be ready to submit by the end of the summer prior to either starting the next academic year. Disseminating your work is really also very important to this process. Make sure that it's easy for people who attend your talk to get a copy of your paper and your slides, right? So one way you could do that at the end of your talk, you could put up your email address. I've even seen people put up little QR codes, where they can scan that and get the information for getting the paper. Create a personal website. So one of my advisees, Sandy Student, shout out to Sandy. Sandy just got a academic position at the University of Delaware. Very proud of him. And if you Google Sanford Student, one of the first hits you'll get is his personal webpage. And one of the things that actually helped him get this job, this is a true story. When I sent an email to one of my friends who's on the search committee, I said, listen, my advisee, Sandy, is applying for this job. He's terrific. And, he wrote back that he had done a quick Google and gone straight, it took him straight to Sandy's personal webpage. And he was immediately able to see Sandy's Vita, his most recent work that he had actually gotten published. It was all right there. So I think having something like that as a graduate student is really, really a good idea. It's a great way for people. If they didn't see your email address or whatever, they're just going to Google you, right? And so make sure that your personal webpage is something that will come up when people Google you. Make strategic use of social media. Like, so Twitter is much maligned, but this is the one thing I really find Twitter good for, is getting information on new papers when people are disseminating them, creating a little bit of a network through Twitter to disseminate new work. Mastodon is a new outlet. You might also consider that as a way of doing that as well. And then I think if you then create a preprint, when you've submitted, hopefully some of you have heard of SciArchive is a really nice place for creating preprints. That's a great way, like once you have it there, it makes it really easy for people just to follow a link to go to get something that's open access for everyone to see your work in a preprint form. Okay, last slide before we'll just turn to open conversation and questions. I just want to mention some things that I think can get you stuck in this process that I've just described, this pipeline from presenting at a conference to publishing. One of them is overreacting to a bad discussant, right? And this can happen in both directions. So often discussants are, discussants are usually quite good, right? And people are chosen to be discussants because they have knowledge of the topic, or they just tend to be really good at providing feedback. So usually you should take to heart the things that a discussant has to say and try to address them. But here's a thing to appreciate. Many times a discussant is only really given your paper, if you gave them a paper, a couple hours of thought, right? And you've maybe been thinking and working on this for many, many months. Sometimes the discussant just had a bad night of sleep. Maybe they're, didn't have their coffee before your talk. And so I think there's sometimes a tendency to overreact to a not carefully thought out comment from a discussant. So you have to be careful not to overreact if something a discussant says is like a 180 from where you're going. That doesn't, the discussant isn't always right. So it's a good thing to take up, to talk to with your advisor, with a mentor, but don't let sort of even a particular focal idea from a discussant, or if a discussant is not very professional and is mean, like don't overreact to that. The other, it goes in both directions. The same thing can be true. You can get a discussant that's extremely effusive and very positive, right? And I think it's more likely the case that you'll see that than the opposite. These days, like, people don't want to be mean, especially with a graduate student. And so their tendency is to try to be encouraging. Sometimes that might not be actually what you need. I mean, like the encouragement, I want to be encouraging, but sometimes what you really need is someone who's going to be honest about where there's a flaw or a hole in your paper. Sometimes it's better to get the discussant that really shines a light on a part of your paper that's weak than a discussant that's just effusive, right? So I think you have to be careful of overreacting in both ways. You don't want to overreact if somebody's been too negative to your paper, extremely negative to your paper, but you don't want to sort of think that if someone's been effusive and very encouraging, that your paper is just good to go. You're ready to submit it straight away. So just be careful on both ends of that. The other piece that these two go together is a thing that can really get you stuck is not sticking to your timeline. So I mentioned the idea of writing a memo, creating a timeline for getting your work from a conference paper into a manuscript you can submit. No one is going to be on you about this. It's kind of up to you, right? And that's a nice, like, if you're interested in going into academia, it's a really good trial for you, because that's one of the biggest challenges. I'm sure Hong Lee could agree. No one's on you to say, hey, when have you submitted your paper? Is it coming? Like, it's up to you. If you choose not to stick to the timeline, you just don't, right? And it's going to have its own repercussions and ramifications. So you really need to try to figure out a way to create timelines that you'll actually meet. The thing where that is really important is many times, and there are occasions, I think the most recently, this was true for COVID, right? There were certain papers that during the time of the pandemic were critical in terms of their timeliness, right? And if you missed that window for the timeliness, you may not be able to get it published anymore, right? So papers that were disseminating sort of estimates of the effect of COVID on student learning were critical, like during the pandemic and within the year after that, right? If you have a paper now that you had written that was about the effects of the COVID from 2 years ago, right? Like, it's going to be a harder sell to get that published. So missing your timeline can really be problematic, so especially if there's a time-sensitive topic. Another thing that can get you stuck is poor communication with co-authors, right? So it may well be that you wrote a memo to yourself, but you had a team and they're not on the same timeline as you are, right? So it's really important that when you create those sorts of timelines that everybody is on the same page about it, and that you have had a conversation about things like who's doing what, who has what role and responsibility if it's a group project, who is going to be, you know, if you were the lead, this is important, if you were the lead presenter, are you also slated to be the lead author on the paper that's going to be submitted for publication? You need to have those conversations, even though they can be a little uncomfortable at times. You have to find a way to have those conversations. The earlier, the better. And the last one is this, and this is a maybe not feedback that you'll often get, is that sometimes people don't recognize that there's a saying, you need to know whether to fish, keep fishing, right? Keep putting the line in, or to cut bait, right? And to know that you're not like, you know, you think the fish is biting, but really you're not going to pull it up, just cut loose. And that's just the idea, is that there are sometimes that when you're an academic, and this has happened to almost any academic I know, there are projects and studies you just don't seem promising. They just don't work out, right? And sometimes it's kind of like, you think of it as like an industry. There's R&D, right? And there's certain research you do that never makes it into development, right? And that's just a sunk cost. And you have to be willing to accept that. And so there's a fair number of things that I've done over my career where I invested many, many months of time, and then, you know, maybe presented or even got into manuscript form, somebody gave me feedback and they really hit on an important flaw, right? And what I saw in the flaw was that in order for me to address the flaw, it might take me another 6 to 12 months to really do justice to that, right? And maybe I didn't have 6 to 12 months. You know, I had to turn to, you know, so you have to be thinking about, look, how much more time is this going to take me? What other projects do I have going? Is this really, do I think there's a high probability this is going to make a contribution, that it could be publishable? And sometimes the answer to that is no. And you have to be okay with that, that sometimes it's best to just let something go and move on to the next thing. So that may be something that happens with the conference presentation, that sometimes that what you'll get out of it is maybe the best advice is to give it up and move on to another idea. All right. So that's maybe not the best way to end my slides, but let me stop sharing there, and let me just sort of turn it over to questions or thoughts or ideas that the rest of you might have.
Thank you so much, Dr. Briggs. And I've learned so much. I wish I knew this, you know, many years earlier, especially about the big tables. I already see questions. Lily, yeah, we can either speak up or we have chat. I see someone, I think Lydia.
Oh, sorry, I was doing the clapping hands one.
Oh,
I think that they look pretty similar, but maybe Janine should go.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Dr. Briggs, for sharing all of this information with us. It has been extraordinarily helpful. I have a question particularly for students who present posters. So a lot of times the graduate students, we have poster sessions to help students get their first kind of presentation out. And so in the poster sessions, they're often exposed to a number of people who kind of come by and give quick feedback. So one of the things I was thinking about was having QR codes for people to kind of give like instant feedback on their cell phone. But is there some kind of mechanism that you could suggest for helping those students capture that feedback? Because they may be standing there for 90 minutes and come across 20 different people. And, you know, how are they to, you know, reach out and connect with all of those people for help with their paper, or even disseminate their paper if they don't have something ready to go right away?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think your idea, first of all, of QR codes where, you know, people have the opportunity to leave like written feedback and comments is a good one. I don't know how many people are likely to do that in the poster context. You know, I think that, like, most people are sort of browsing through, and whether they're going to stop and actually write out their feedback, I don't know. I tend to think that for the posters in particular, the main thing that you're actually more likely to want to accomplish is just networking, right? Is just connecting with people that see you get the idea of the thing that you're working on and that you've met them. Just the fact that you met them once there, it gives you a nice opening that if you then see them at a reception following, you have a nice thing to start talking about, right? At the reception. They can say, hey, you know, I saw your poster. You say, oh yeah, I remember you came by. And then you can get into the much more deeper conversation there, right? Where you can get that kind of feedback on the fly. And then following that second layer of feedback, they're much more likely than to be giving you something in writing, right? So I would be focusing much more on the poster. And this is really true for the, you know, conferences in general. It's just the opportunity to meet some people that are interested in your work and whose work you might be interested in.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Other questions or experience, comments you want to share?
Yeah, I'd be super interested if any of you, you know, are willing to sort of share what your experiences have been in giving a presentation, whether you had a good interaction with your discussants or other members of who was presenting with you, or if you gave a poster. It would be wonderful if just, not just for me, but just the rest of it, for everybody to hear, like, you know, positives and negatives.
I have a
Okay.
question,
Okay, go ahead.
and it could be just anybody answering. So I've had quite a few experiences presenting at conferences, and it used to be that I'd carry copies of the paper with me, whether it was to accompany a poster or the actual paper. But nowadays, I'm wondering, is that really the right thing to do, to like try and drag a bunch of paper to another city on the plane? Or is it better to like provide like a QR code, or offer just some PDFs, or bring just like a one pager? Like what kind of, you know, what's more of best practice now when flying to a conference doesn't always mean that you want to carry a ton of stuff back with you?
Yeah, I mean, I think generally almost nobody, it used to be the case that people would come with, you know, paper copies of their papers to distribute. I love your idea of a one pager. I think that's such a great idea. At this point, it's sort of gone so much in the other direction that everything is digital and conveyed electronically, that in some ways it's sort of novel to have something that's actually written out for people to read. And so it might not be at all a bad idea to have like in your back pocket, like three to five, you know, a double-sided printed out version of your paper, because that's probably what the most you can usually expect, that you get people are that interested, they really want to read your paper. And for them, maybe it's some kind of novel, like, oh, here's an actual, it's there, like I'm holding it and I can read it on the plane, you know? So I think that's actually not a bad idea. Like it's kind of like, like these days, I'm just almost nostalgic. I get sick of reading everything digitally, and I want to read some things like a book. I just want a real in my hand. So that's actually not, I think, at all a bad idea. I love the idea of a one pager in particular, because it's something, you know, one page, you hand it out and it, you know, it hits the, like, here are the main key findings. I think that's a really good advertisement. So I think this is like a both and, right? Like, I think you do need to have all the ways for people to get it digitally, right? But then like an extra advertisement to have a few hard copies, stack of, you know, like 21 pagers and, you know, 3 fully printed out. I think that's a good idea. Yeah.
Thanks.
Other questions? Oh, yeah, go
Sorry.
ahead.
No, go ahead.
No, yeah, Lydia, yeah, go ahead.
Okay, thanks. Thanks so much, Derek. I think I'm still kind of confused about, and just generally bad at knowing when something is like conference ready, especially if we go through the act of writing out like the intro, the methods, having like a proper paper, knowing that we're still going to use the summer to get the manuscript in better shape. Like, when do you feel comfortable? Like, when do you know that you've done enough for the conference, I guess?
Yeah, that's a good, so like, when do you know, let me follow up. Are you asking, when do you know you're ready to submit a proposal for a conference? Or are you asking, once you've already submitted the proposal, when do you know it's like good enough to be ready to write a paper to present?
Yeah, the second one.
Second one, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that you never actually know for sure. So I think that, like, in some sense, the more experience you get, the more you have a better feel for that, because you've had the repetitions, right? And you have a greater depth of knowledge about the literature and the field itself, right? So in that case, you're more likely to know if something is a contribution to the literature the more experience you have, right? And so that just comes with time. But that said, it's often when you're in the middle of something, it's hard to know if you're able to see the forest for the trees. And there are times where it's not until you're writing up the final results that you actually see a flaw, or someone points it out to you. So you'll never know that for sure. And in some sense, that's one of the things that the role of a discussant and people seeing your work can provide for you, right? So I think the main thing is to be upfront with people when you're giving a conference presentation. If you are unsure about things, if there are things in your work where you're struggling, that's where I say upfront, write to the discussant and be like, here's what we have. Here's a part where we're still struggling. We're working on this part. Any feedback you would have along this could be really helpful for us, right? And you could even do that in your presentation itself, and that goes a long way, just sort of being honest and straightforward with your audience. We're all in this together, right? And everybody has been through the same process. So it's better to be, forthright about things you're uncertain about.
I wanted to share that I can relate to the idea of once I present for a conference, I think I'm done. And so it's much harder to move on, especially if it's like a poster where I didn't have to write the paper. So I just did the poster and I'm just done. And so one thing that my advisor and I found helpful, because sometimes the poster also, you don't feel like you have enough. So we did work 2 different conferences. I think it was ARA one year, and the following year we used dichotomous data and polytomous data. So we combined them to have a paper now. That's what I'm working on. So it felt good initially. So I don't feel like I wasted the first 2. And so I thought it might be encouraging to somebody that even if it's, as long as it's not time sensitive, like you said, if it's something that is a bit more methodological and it's still a little novel, if you had previous conferences, you could go back and maybe improve upon them. Because if you did a poster like I tend to have done, it really feels complete. I don't know. I just want to take it off and then just go back, because I'm like, it just took so much energy. So I'm just done. But then it helped to add something new and make it a little bit more exciting now. And so I thought that would be encouraging. I don't know if you had said it because I came in a little late, but thank you for the presentation.
Yeah, great point. Yeah. Yeah, that's why I even suggest, like, early on, even when you're doing a poster, write a short paper about the poster. There's a sense in which there's a story you're telling already in the poster. So, perhaps you could turn that into a narrative early on, and it gives you the framework, at least, that it's an easier jump than if all you have is the poster. You have a little bit to start with to keep fleshing out and building. But otherwise, I like your idea a lot. Sometimes what you're getting from a poster is a kernel of some good ideas to follow up and to build upon. Even sometimes a poster, what it might produce is a few fantastic graphics, right, that you've used that convey your idea, and you keep returning to those and using them in other settings. That can be a big win. Yeah. Janine, did you have another comment?
Yes, thank you. To add on to the conversation about feedback, I would suggest rarely do we present a single paper in a session. So, the people who are presenting with us, they may not have the exact same topic, but there's a common thread. And so I have found that past presentations where our topic happened to be related to minority college students, there was a study done in Canada, and then I was working with another group, and just communicating with the other people who were presenting, we were able to bounce ideas off of each other and kind of extend both of our work. So I thought that was interesting. And then the QR code thing, I'm kind of stuck there. I'm trying to let it go because I like the novel idea of paper. But when I did a poster presentation, I had a QR code to make the poster interactive, so that people would do a portion of my questionnaire to see if their data matched my findings, or if their ideas matched my findings. And a lot of people were really surprised, and that stimulated a lot of conversation, which enabled me to get good feedback and say, hey, can you just go ahead and add that to the notes part? So just finding ways of asking the questions that you want to ask, not necessarily how can I improve this, but, were these findings surprising? Just figuring out ways to just collect all of the information, because I'm very much in the moment. And so when it's over, like Nana said, I kind of want to go decompress somewhere and just kind of let everything go for the day. But when you do that and you put too much space in between the, processing the information and reacting to it, you run the risk of not following up.
Yeah, I mean, I will say, I do want to make sure that no one's mishearing me to say, like, you can't give yourself a day to just like be happy and celebrate that you did a great job. And we, as in the field, don't do enough to celebrate the small victories. And I think we need to, right? So each stage along the pipeline, you need to celebrate when you've made progress, right? It's just, don't let that be the end. Like, see where it's going is the key thing. But those are some great suggestions, Janine.
Other comments or questions?
I really wanted to say that it was amazing, all the advice that you gave us, and I think it's going to be super useful now that we're approaching the next NCME meeting. So I'm very thankful for that. Something that has happened with some of the papers that I have presented in the last year, or the last 2 NCMEs, if you want, is that I have the manuscript ready. I send it, of course, to my discussant, but since it's ready with enough time, I usually send it for publication too. So I submit it, and it's kind of going in both. I'm receiving feedback from the discussants, and I'm receiving feedback from my reviewers. I know this is kind of different from what you've been saying right now, but I keep finding myself in this way of, how do I introduce this feedback when my reviewers have already, seen it, and they already made their minds about what specific things I need to address. What are your thoughts on that?
Oh, I'm so glad you raised this, because yeah, I made it seem much more linear than it often is, in that it's often the case that you're really trying to do is to complete a research project, complete a study. And there are multiple ways in which you're then disseminating the results. The conference presentation is one, but in some sense, like, especially if you're wanting to go into a career in academia, ultimately it's sort of publishing it in a peer-reviewed journal that is the most important. So if you have something that's completed and is ready to be disseminated, you think, in a peer-reviewed outlet, you don't need to wait. You certainly don't need to first give the conference presentation and wait until that to know. Absolutely, you could be doing these at the same time. So your point is a really good one. What if you do that, and the feedback you get in a conference raises something that's quite different from what's being raised by then the reviewers of your manuscript? To me, I think that the point should be that you're always trying to decide as the author is, like, what is the story, right, of the study that I've done? What are the key findings? And it's like the Rashomon's tale of different people looking at the elephant and feeling different bits and coming to different interpretations of what they're seeing. That's the same thing when you do a study where the reviewers have one take. You have a particular take. The people who are at a conference, they see a different thing. And ultimately, you're the one that makes the decision as to what is the best representation that contributes to the field. And you have to negotiate that with the editor of the journal. So I think you have to be the arbiter of that. Just like this would be a different session to talk just about the publication process and navigating reviews, right? But if it were the case that something that came up in the conference was much more insightful to moving your paper forward than what the reviewer said, I think you could make that case to the editor, right? I think that's something that you could, in revising your paper, if that were to happen, I would literally write to the editor and say, in my plan of how I plan to do this revision, here's I think I'll take up the feedback from the reviewers. However, this other thing came up, right, in presenting the paper, and I feel like this needs to be addressed as well. Or if it contradicts the reviewer, that's great. You have now, a good case against the famous reviewer too, right?
That's right.
But,
Thank you.
yeah. So I think one thing we have to really appreciate is this is all negotiable. Everything is negotiable, right? And editors are humans, and you need to be willing to engage. And even as a graduate student, you need to be willing to engage.
That's right. Thank you. I appreciate that. It's always the sense of waiting what or how to address these things. And I guess of course as a grad student and soon to be a doctor, it always is like, well, I don't have the power, dynamics to make those decisions directly, but I'm learning, so I appreciate that. A lot.
So one thing I learned from NCME is like the discussions are really helpful. I almost follows the linear procedure. I'll send out an article after, and I feel, when I was younger, I had a lot of self-doubts.
Hong Li, I'm sorry, you're kind of drifting in and out. I don't know if your microphone.
Oh, okay. So is this better?
It's still kind of like we'll hear one thing loud and the next thing is really soft.
Oh, it's fine. Okay, so I'm just saying like the discussions are very helpful to get a general impression of the quality of my work, and also sometimes help me decide where I can send my paper, which journal.
Right.
Yeah. Sometimes I got feedback from discussing that I couldn't solve the problem. They are my lowers are the tier of the journal that I was made to. So to me, like the NCME conference publication.
Yeah, what I some of those things we missed, but I think what I took away from what you were saying that I think is a really nice point is that the one thing the discussion can often help you with is sort of thinking through like what would be an appropriate outlet, like or a journal for you to publish your work, and so that can be a really good conversation to engage in for sure.
So we have 1 minute. If you have a final question or comment.
Dr. Lee was my esteemed advisor in graduate school. I was trained by her in my approaches to submitting papers. And I just want to second what she said, that it's helpful to just kind of like send things out, get some feedback from reviewers, see what they're interested in. You can even compare what the discussant said, and see if there are changes, and then again come back with the editors and the reviewers. And yeah, reviewer 2 is usually the really tough one. But as someone who is trained with Dr. Lee's approach, I think it has worked pretty well for us. So I just wanted to throw my 2 cents in there as a last minute. So
thank you.
Thanks for that.
It's nice to see you here. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Briggs. And also I want to thank Montessera for coordinating. She's the lead of the Brownback sessions for NCME GISIC.
Great. It's my pleasure to talk. If any of you have anything you want to know about follow-up, feel free to drop me an email. Always happy to help out. And hope to see you all at NCME at the conference in Chicago.
Thank you, Dr. Briggs. We're gonna make sure to invite you to our to our paper sessions. Just a quick reminder before you leave, there are so many other events in NCME GISIC that are happening that we would love you to attend to. We're finishing up writing our recommendations for the standards in testing. We have Viernes Social, or Social Friday. Janine can say more about that. Is it coming up next week?
Yeah, February 3rd. It's the first Friday of every month, from 4:30 to 6 o'clock. Okay, and you can check the GSIC calendar for the link.
Thank you, Janine. And there are also other Brownbacks in February and March. So thank you for assisting to this one, and looking forward to seeing you in the next ones.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Bye, all.
Bye-bye.